Oh, hey.
So I've decided to dedicate the next few weeks of my life to learning about the history of where I was born, Brisbane, and then creating a collection of artworks relating to the most interesting things that I've learned. Now, why am I doing this? Well, as an artist, I've been feeling a bit indecisive in regards to what I actually want to create. Okay, I'm at the stage where creating an artwork is pretty freaking easy, but making it meaningful is actually quite difficult, because there's a lot of artists with very interesting life experiences and perspectives to offer, but I'm just a regular dude. Okay, and I don't really have a consistent message or topic that I really want to attach to my brand, so I thought, why not try to do this new thing where I dive into a brand new topic each week, learn as much as I can, and see what kind of art I can create. So, the first book I decided to read was about the Brisbane River, because honestly, the idea of purely reading about buildings, railways, roads, just made me want to kill myself. But anyway, the most interesting things I learnt from this book was the following. First of all, the Brisbane River, unlike now, wasn't always brown, okay? It actually used to be a source of food and a place of leisure and swimming. Yeah, swimming, okay? Apparently there were these things called swimming baths that were basically encased parts of the river to create a mini swimming pool that the public would, go in for a leisurely swim or do swimming races. And yeah, apparently it was very safe and even shark-proof. Yeah, shark-proof. Anyway, another thing I learnt was that this is what water police used to look like, and how they used to get around, which has made me laugh, honestly. Imagining these guys trying to chase down crims in a fucking kayak. Poor blokes, honestly. And then another thing I learnt was about the 1893 floods, which caused some serious damage and even destroyed the first Victoria Bridge. Yeah, that was the first one that just got destroyed, along with many other infrastructures, which, yeah, of course was horrible, but resulted in some pretty sick photography, not gonna lie. But anyway, did this first book inspire any artworks? Not really, honestly, okay? It was kind of cool to look at, okay? Some of the photos were nice, and it was cool to look at, the 18 and 1900s. But there was one page at the beginning of the book that really motivated me to do some additional research that I thought I'd be really interested in. Now, after reading the first book, which I wouldn't say was boring, but more so not that interesting, I actually thought learning about Aboriginal history would be a nice change, okay? More specifically, the Turrbal and Yagara people, as there's so much I don't know about these Aboriginal communities. Honestly, the only time I hear about them is when I flick on a footy game and there's an acknowledgement of country that's just sometimes followed by a sick tune. But I was also interested in learning more, as Brisbane has only been colonised for 200 years in comparison to Aboriginal communities who have inhabited this land for around 25,000 years. 25,000. But anyway, here's the most interesting facts I found doing my own research, okay? Firstly, the Turrbal and Yagara people actually call Brisbane Meanjin, okay? Honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I thought it was pronounced Mean Gin, as in yeah, dude, that's a mean gin. But no, it's Meanjin, okay? And it means the place of the blue water lilies, okay? And the Brisbane River was called Maiwar, okay? No, not only as the river to Aboriginals, but also a living being, which, as previously mentioned, was not only a rich food source, but also an area for large gatherings between different Aboriginal groups, which was possible as the river could be navigated and crossed through canoes that they actually made from tree bark. That's pretty freaking impressive. Can you imagine trying to make a canoe with bark? Fucking bark. Anyway, another gathering ground I found out about was actually Victoria Park, or Brisbane. I think I'm saying that right. But anyway, Brisbane means a windy place. And yeah, after arriving there, pretty spot on description, not gonna lie. But yeah, this is my first time actually visiting Brisbane, and Jesus Christ, I could not get over how massive this place was. I didn't even have time to explore it all, because it just would have taken me all day. So it makes a lot of sense this was an important gathering ground for not only Turrbal and Yagara people, but for many different Aboriginal tribes, participating in initiation ceremonies, performances, storytelling, and conflict resolution over thousands of generations. Another fascinating part of my research was finding quotes from early settlers and convicts that actually describe their first encounters with Aboriginal. Now, I find these fascinating because, I don't know about you guys, but I always thought Aboriginals sort of just lived like cavemen, like before the... Wait, is that racist? Anyway, turns out Aboriginal communities were a lot more advanced based on the following quotes that I found, okay? First one describing where they live, okay? Frederick Strange in 1830 said, native huts extending upwards of 80 feet with arches beautifully turned and a finish with a degree of skill which would not have disgraced an English architect, okay? Another quote from John Finnegan, the number of huts erected was so numerous I could hardly count them. And another bit of information I found out was people who settled in Moreton Bay predicted that these Aboriginal communities went up to around 5,000 people. Okay, and this was obviously like due to the rich marine food sources that they found, through the Brisbane River and rivers nearby. But basically, I think this paints a really clear picture that the Turrbal and Yagara people were actually very advanced, skilled, and deeply structured communities, okay? So much so that I also found out some early convicts and settlers escaped prison or left European society to actually live amongst these Aboriginal communities, which I had no idea about, okay? A few examples is James Davis. He lived in an Aboriginal community for 14 years, like learning the language, the law, how to survive, and ended up returning back to European society later. Another one was Richard Craig, who was fully adopted into a Aboriginal tribe, and struggled a lot leaving that tribe. And then the last example I saw was George Brown, who lived with the Turrbal people and completely abandoned European society. Just decided to live there until he died. But yeah, this is something I actually found very intriguing, actually quite wholesome, because whenever you hear people discuss Australian history, more specifically Aboriginals and settlers, they're always against each other, and they always discuss the conflict between them. So yeah, I thought it's kind of nice to know that there were people back then in even the 1800s who took the time to understand and live within these Aboriginal communities. But anyway, since this part of Brisbane's history was really starting to interest me, okay, I decided to hunt this book down, okay, which I could only find in the local studies section of the library. Ooh, exclusive. But when I found it, I was very happy, and I had a feeling this was going to be a really fun read. Oh, that was not fun. So it turns out this book is actually about the colonisation of Brisbane and the treatment of Aboriginals during this time, which I always knew was horrible, but turns out the treatment was actually more horrible and sinister than I ever thought it was. Because although this book isn't a fun read, it's a very informative and eye-opening book with quotes and detailed accounts from Aboriginals, settlers and convicts who lived between 1824 and 1860. So just a quick viewer discretion, some of the things I'm going to be discussing in this section are very disturbing, violent, and quite confronting. Alright, let's start from the beginning, okay? September 13th, 1824 was when Europeans decided to settle and build on the Brisbane area, okay? Now, they originally decided to settle here not to live or build a society, but to create a penal colony. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering, what the fuck is a penal colony? So basically, a penal colony is a prison where convicts from Sydney and other areas were sent for harsher punishment. So it's basically like a prison for prisoners. So already not a good start that the Europeans saw this beautiful land and were like, yeah, let's turn it into a prison. But anyway, although there were accounts of Aboriginals trying to approach this settlement peacefully from people such as Thomas Atkins, who stated that the blacks came down to the settlement crying out Mogwai, meaning white man. Despite this, no effort was made by Europeans to communicate or work with Aboriginal communities, and they just sort of continued destroying the land and food sources to build their penal colony. So in retaliation, Aboriginals began strategically destroying the European crops as an act of resistance, and this one act of resistance is when the murders and the true conflict began. More specifically, settlers began shooting Aboriginal people to protect crops. Okay, now from this moment on, these actions became a pattern. Okay, Aboriginal resistance would be labelled as a attack, while settler violence such as shooting them would be described as necessary protection. Now this conflict was ongoing and there were many cases of violence documented in this book, okay, but I just wanted to go through a few that I found quite shocking and ones that I had never been taught about before. Okay, let's start off with the Kilcoy Massacre. So in early 1842, a group of settlers at the Kilcoy station decided to hand out bags of flour as rations to Aboriginal communities, okay? It was seen as a gift, and obviously the flour was shared amongst families and Aboriginal communities, but what they didn't know was this flour had been purposefully mixed with arsenic, okay? And as a result, around 40 to 60 Aboriginals were poisoned and would have suffered horrific and agonizing deaths, okay? Especially because I learned, basically, if you consume arsenic, it pretty much cooks you from the inside, okay? It causes like organ failure, intense vomiting, seizures, convulsions. It's just fucking horrendous. So I think this act specifically really just highlighted to me just how like disgusting, cruel, and just evil settlers were coming towards Aboriginal communities. And what's even worse about this situation is like there were letters describing this poisoning that were literally published, and almost nothing happened to the people who did it. Speaking on what was published at the time, newspapers also played a huge role in spreading like racist views about Aboriginals, okay? They were described in newspapers as like dangerous and incapable of civilization, which is basically an attempt to justify violent acts and dehumanize Aboriginal people. And if for any reason you may disagree that settlers dehumanized Aboriginals during this time, let me tell you another story I read in this book about an Aboriginal man called Kipper Billy. Alright, so in 1862, Kipper Billy was convicted of a murder, okay? And it was in a trial that is considered deeply flawed, okay? As the evidence from the record shows that witnesses couldn't even identify the accused. And on top of this, Kipper Billy didn't even speak fluent English, and therefore he couldn't respond or even understand the charges that were against him. But anyway, this rocky conviction led to Kipper Billy's execution. But what happened next was even more disturbing. After his death, a prominent Brisbane chemist named Thomas Worry took it upon himself to dig up the grave, remove his head, and reportedly display it at dinner parties as a scientific interest. Just such an eerie example of how Aboriginals were treated and dehumanized. Now, these are just two details from the book, but as you can imagine, there were many more ongoing incidents that had been documented, from public hangings, sexual violence, kidnapping, and all sorts of acts that I never knew or thought would have occurred in a place where I grew up. Okay, so quite a dark ending to this learning experience, if I'm being honest. Although this was a very confronting book to read, okay, quite difficult at times, I do think it was worth it, because I learned a lot of new things that I had no idea about, and it resulted in some great artworks in my opinion. But I think a good way to finish this video is to talk about the last artwork I made, which I've called The Place of the Blue Water Lilies. So what I did in this artwork is combine the only images I could find from Aboriginals in the 1800s with a photo of James Davis, which you might remember is the convict who actually joined an Aboriginal community and lived with them for years, okay? And I've sort of merged both of their faces, or both of these faces, into a blue water lily, which I think is a pretty harmonious symbol. Now, the point of me making this artwork was to sort of use James Davis as a benchmark for other Australians. Yeah, I guess it's also a reminder to me as well to not be so oblivious and, you know, resistant towards learning about new cultures, especially about Aboriginal culture, considering it's the oldest culture in the world and the first culture and way of living that occurred in what we now know as Brisbane. But anyway, here's a closer look at the 4 artworks I made during this learning experience. Okay, I'm really happy with how all these turned out, and I want to figure out how I can give them to you guys, okay? So if you're unaware, I am trying to be more active on Instagram currently and TikTok, and for the next few weeks, I want to use those platforms for you guys to help let me know how you would want these artworks, okay? Whether you'd want them on t-shirts, canvases, posters, or, you know, anything that you would personally like to buy. Because for every sale of one of these artworks, I'm going to be donating all the profits I make to the Kurbangui Youth and Family Development, which is a Brisbane-based Aboriginal community-led organisation that pretty much just supports young people and families through cultural programs and educational support. But anyway, this is my first sort of art collection made through this learning experience. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I definitely enjoyed making it, and I'm excited to see what I will learn about next.